So welcome, my good friend, Ken Womack, legend, Beatles author, and of course, most recently, a wonderful two-volume work on George Martin. But now the book we've been waiting for so many years, the story of Mal Evans. So before you started on the book, how much did you know about Mal?
I think I just knew what we most of us did, right? I knew that I knew the broad strokes. I knew the outline of this guy who was photobombing all of the Beatles pictures.
Yeah.
This seemed like an affable fellow, right? Which is the number one word people use, affable.
Affable.
When I would ask them about Mal, I knew that he had died in a hail of bullets, to be blunt.
Yeah.
So I certainly knew about that. But I think, like most people, I was sympathetic to him. He's a big, lovable guy who was living the Beatles' dream, right? I mean, he's the fans' perfect dream is to have that kind of access.
Yeah, well, that's it. I mean, because, we think of two of the people who are the closest to the Beatles were Mal and Neil Aspinall.
That's right. And so I thought it would be interesting. And when I was asked to do it by Gary Evans, I mean, Gary is a lovable guy, and within minutes I knew I would write it because I love Gary. And he put no stipulations on telling the story. And he warned me that parts of it would be rough going. But I think, like most people, I figured I could get 80,000 words out of telling his story. But that's when Gary told me he had all this stuff. And I said, "Can I see it?" And so, he mailed it. And in fact, there's the box.
Oh, wow.
That the first package came in, and it became pretty clear very quickly that this was an organizational archival challenge as much as anything else, because, nothing was organized. It was all sort of crammed together. 67 was next to 74. Photos from all those periods were kind of a hodgepodge. So it really meant first and foremost spending about a year just organizing it.
Wow. And of course, I mean, the legend of Mal's diaries has sort of been known for a number of years, that we knew that he kept a diary, and that there's sort of been attempts to publish them, but we didn't know what was in them. So how did you and Gary get in touch?
Gary had met Simon Weitzman, our good friend, at I believe it was the 50th anniversary of the Mad Day Out. And that's when they became friends. And Gary told Simon that he was looking for someone to tell the story that he could trust. And Simon said, "You ought to talk to Ken." And so at the beginning of COVID, we got on Zoom like you and I are doing now. And and Gary and I have spent about 1,000 hours since
I
on
can
Zoom
imagine.
hanging out. Yeah. I mean, you've met him. He's wonderful, and is
Yeah, lovely guy.
really great people. And right, and so he, sent all the materials over here, and that's when I realized very quickly this was more than an 80,000 word. This guy was born and he died.
Yeah,
Kind of
there was a
story.
lot in between.
Yeah.
Why the title of Living the Beatles Legend?
Well, this is where we get into the fun world of professional publishing. I wanted to call it Brother Malcolm after the usage in a very famous Beatles song. And the publisher said, and I think I do agree with them, that, that sounds a lot like Malcolm X, and maybe we don't want to
Yeah,
invite that. And then we went through many, 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 many choice, many different kinds of ideas about what this could be. And I finally suggested that because it was Mal's title. And it was a compromise, and we liked it. And of course, it was what he was doing, right? I mean, he was trying to live it out every bit as much as they did themselves. And he was probably living it longer than they did, since, it was such a key, overwhelming aspect of his life.
yeah. It's sort of it took over everything, didn't it? From this humble guy who worked for the GPO in Liverpool, ends up in the center of absolutely everything that the Beatles were doing.
Yeah, and of course, one of the first issues that we note is that Mal was the first person to be educated in his family, the first person to own a car, to own a house, and this was a major undertaking. It wasn't just a lark. He didn't just start becoming their roadie. He quit one life to join another, and suffered those fearsome consequences for the rest of his life.
Yeah, yeah, which can't have been easy for Gary, because obviously there's a lot of family struggles mixed in with all this, both financial and of being around as a father.
It has been a challenging life for Gary. He's very much Mal in a lot of ways. He's a big cuddly guy.
Yeah.
He is sensitive, which was certainly Mal was. But gregarious. He loves meeting people, spending time with folks. We took him to the Mad Day Out while we were visiting you this summer, right after we saw you. And it was suddenly like Gary was on tour. Tour groups were posing with him because they figured out who he was.
Yeah.
We went to St. Pancras, and we thought we'd be there for 20 minutes. We were there for 2 hours because Gary was posing tour groups. So Mal's legend does loom large. But yeah, it's been very difficult for him. And probably even more so because of this book, because as soon as I began working on it, I was contacted by lots of folks who had their own stories to tell about Mal, some of which were very unhappy.
Yeah.
Really no one refused to talk to me about him. They either loved him or loved him because they knew he was flawed or what have you. And so folks were very open, but in being open, those stories are pretty rough. And, Gary has been living with the brutal fact since before his father died that when it came to Beatles versus Beatles versus family, who won every single time.
Yeah.
I mean, you've read the part, right, about when Julie's born and the Beatles are like, dude, go to Liverpool.
Yeah.
What are you doing?
Be with your family.
Yeah.
In some ways, this is very brave of Gary to do this because, as you said, Mal's a flawed character, lovable, but he did sort of sacrifice family to a degree to follow the Beatles and to be part of their entourage and be, tied in with all that fame.
I'll give you a perfect example of one of the things that we discovered that I had trouble telling him, and it was hard to do. Mal saw, as you know, his family exactly one time after he moved to America in January 1974. Gary and Julie really needed to believe that it was because he wanted to see them. And he visited in around April 1975. And because I'd interviewed Gary about this 3 years ago, almost 4 years ago at this point, I was working under the assumption that, Mal was being a good father. Mal was not there to see them. He was there because he was given a swanky hotel room by David Frost's production team to be in the salute to the Beatles. And, it was very hard for me to have to say that, because it was one of those little bits that I think they were hanging on to, and it just wasn't true. He was, they were the afterthought, and he was there to stay in a swanky hotel, really, and hang out with the folks with the television cameras.
Yeah, that must be hard, and because he was someone that was in the public eye, and as you say, he did love to photobomb. There's almost like the complete opposite of Neil Aspinall, who liked to stay in the background. Mal loved to be up there, and Gary's had to see that and say, "Oh, that's my dad," but I never really see him. That can't be easy, and this must have been. I know maybe part of it's cathartic, but it must have been quite painful to go through this as well, because you've got to go through every detail like that. Like, that can't be easy.
No, I mean, and like I say, you meet Gary, you can't help but love him, and I do. And some of those times have been hard. That was the toughest one, though.
Oh, I
To
can
have to
imagine.
say, we've been clinging to this. It's not this.
Yeah, yeah. So obviously you've gone through all the diaries. How detailed did he go into stuff day by day?
Well, so the historical record's fascinating because it operates very much like life with the Beatles would when you think about it, kind of in a practical sense, right? So, for example, let's take January 1969. Everybody's been watching the docuseries ad nauseum for the last 2 or 3 years, right?
Yeah,
Um, Almost nothing in January. It's a quiet month in the diary because he's
wow.
working like a maniac, and he's basically working, an 8 to 8 job, or 8 to 11 p.m. job, because he's getting up in the morning, many days taking some or multiple Beatles to Twickenham and then later to Apple
Yeah,
Studios. Then he's working on Apple artists at night and running errands at night. So he is just knackered in January
yeah.
1969. When they're gone on tour, for the most part, those can be pretty quiet months because his time
That's
is just
crazy.
sucked dry. But he will come back and then he'll fill pages of the diary. Or in some years, the diary is kind of quiet, but then he'll have notebooks. So there's a 1966 notebook that's absolutely essential. It's where he talks about working with them on Revolver, going on to that crazy summer tour, right? That,
Yeah, that was
the
interesting, definitely.
Philippines, etc. So if you look at his historical record, different parts of it kind of take precedence as you go along. Sometimes, like in 67 for Sergeant Pepper, etc., the diary is king. He had a lot of time to sit around and write in it.
Yeah.
He was on a bus, in the latter part of the year when he and Neil weren't running after it, putting the poster board back on it, which I thought was hilarious because I don't know about you, but I always thought that was painted on.
Yeah,
Those dorks just had poster board. They were, and that's why sometimes the poster board looks different because
yeah.
they lost it back in, some other county somewhere. So anyway, it just depends on which period it is. So you kind of have to learn. And this is true, I think, with the work that you and I've been doing for years on the Beatles. You have to just realize that some sources are going to be better for different parts
Yeah,
because of practical issues. He did write up the 1965 tour. He wanted to publish it as a book and didn't. That's one of the mysteries I haven't fully solved, by the way, because the
right.
fellow who ran that service, who had put together the
Hmm?
typescripts, died and didn't tell his family what the story was. So
Yeah,
that kind of died with him. And Mal certainly left no notes about it. But anyway, and that manuscript's called Beatles USA, I think. It wasn't a brilliant title, but the long and the short of it is, so when you look at the calendrical, chronology of the story, it's, diary, notebook, diary,
yeah,
notebook, and then he's got 2 or 3 manuscripts,
of course.
and including one that he made when he was writing the book in 1975, which is about 200 pages long. It's a notebook of just random notes, not in order,
Oh,
um, of his thoughts, because he was trying to get everything down so that he could dictate the story.
got you. Yeah. No, mentioning Sergeant Pepper. No, one of the stories that's been talked about for years was how much did Mal contribute to the idea of Sergeant Pepper? So, did you get to the bottom of that?
So I've gotten to the bottom, I think, as much to the bottom of it as we can get, right? So, and I know you've dealt with this challenge too. So what do you do when people have different memories of the same event? So I have some commentary, very slight, from Lennon saying that Mal came up with the title. Ringo seems convinced on multiple occasions that Mal arranged for the title. There's a story that only Mr. McCartney has repeated about salt and pepper. You know, um, Gary loves that one because the idea that his dad needed to know what salt and pepper was, the only thing that Mal liked as much as the Beatles was food. and, and he knew what the salt, so that one is always kind of funny for Gary. So I
Yeah.
just kind of, in the book, I tried to bring them all in. As you know, Mal was a huge history buff, loved particularly military history,
Yeah.
and sergeant sounds just like something that Mal would be interested in.
Yeah.
In fact, there was an overlap where for a while he was in the territorials, and so he was even thinking about a military career before the Beatle career took over. So it kind of sounds like Mal. I try to look at this generously, that it's all collaborative, right? Art is
Yeah.
collaborative. um there's never been such a thing as the solitary genius. When the Brontes were writing by candlelight and creating those fantastic novels, Jane Eyre, for example, right? Other people helped with Jane
Yeah.
Eyre, right?
Yeah.
Somebody had to work as a compositor, somebody had to listen to her read it, somebody had to create typescripts. They probably sat around and talk about plot points. Does that change who wrote it? No, it doesn't. But art, musical art, the fine arts, certainly theatrical work, ballet, all of this is collaborative, right? So I look at it as collaborative, and one person's inspiration can come in many ways, and so I think all of these stories can coexist. But I don't think I think Mal had a pretty heavy hand in that, and was happy to sit with Paul in his music room at Cavendish Avenue and work on those ideas. Mal had hero worship for Paul. He,
Mm.
until the day he died, he adored Paul. Some of his last words were about how great Paul is, and I agree.
Yeah.
um, uh, you know, uh, he adored him and would never take anything away from him. Um,
He's
uh,
kind of a generous type of man as well, that he didn't appear to come forward and try and claim, oh, that was me, that was me, that was me.
no,
He'd,
and he recorded it for his own posterity in his notebooks,
yeah.
and referred to it. He said it was just two friends sitting around a painted piano,
Yeah.
Sergeant Pepper and Fixing a Hole, and that's Mal, right? Mal would have liked a little extra money. I don't know that Paul may very well have given him extra money, and Mal simply didn't record it. I wouldn't be surprised if he had helped out
Yeah,
in
because money
various.
seems to be a bit of a theme all the way
Yeah,
through. That there was a
but
struggle, wasn't
you
it?
know, but Mal was proud. He had a northern pride to him, so he wasn't going to say one way or another. And I bet you notice this too. There's a point in the story where it's clear that Mal is realizing he's writing for some kind of posterity. It's a very interesting but subtle moment, mid 60s, where he's starting to realize this, and he's thinking about what he's going to put down and what he's not going to put down. So there's a lot of truth in this, but the Beatles don't need to be worried about truth about them. It's the truth about himself that is very interesting, and how unguarded he's very guarded about everything but himself.
Yeah.
And it was Ringo who said somewhere around, I guess it would have been 74, 75, he told Mal, whatever you do, tell the truth. And Mal did, about himself, and I'm sure he figured that whatever truth they want to say about themselves, that's their story to tell at some point. I'm not sure if we've received that story yet. Um, you know,
Yeah.
um, Most of this is just Mal's story. So when I talk about things like Mal's belief about what he wrote and what he helped with, I say in Mal's view, right? Mal alleges that he helped with this.
Yeah.
Um, and that coheres with what we know about the story, right? The lines from Lennon about how Paul would occasionally say, I need a line, help me with Eleanor Rigby, help
Exactly.
me with it,
Yeah.
and as I tell my students, art is a social production. We're much better at it now, aren't we? Um,
Absolutely.
I
Yeah,
was at an event here on campus yesterday. As you know, Bruce Springsteen is one of our great benefactors at the university.
yeah.
And we were doing the 50th anniversary of The Wild, the Innocent, and the East Street Shuffle. What a record, right? And
Oh, definitely.
I have so much fun when I teach this every spring. When we talk about the song New York City Serenade, which begins with this incredible piece of classical piano from David Sanchez, right? And who wrote that song? One guy,
Yeah,
Bruce Springsteen. But we all know, I mean, Bruce would tell you if he's sitting here, he didn't write that piece. He couldn't
yeah,
play that. I watched David play it yesterday, and I wrote to the organizer. I said, "This is one of the great privileged moments of my life to watch him
yeah.
play that. It's intricate, it's challenging." He was writing based upon some of the great jazz greats were influencing what he was doing there. So what do we call that?
Well, it's like,
It's a
as you're saying, talking about the Get Back documentary. And I think one of the bits that I enjoyed the most was, seeing the song of Get Back developing. The sitting around, Paul's just thumping away on his bass, and the melody's almost there. It's there, but you suddenly got to understand the collaboration of the Beatles in putting a song together, and how you start with this basic idea, then you end up on the rooftop with the finished song, and
That's right.
that's it.
And the way it merges then with ideas Paul had already had about Commonwealth and the issues with the very ugly racism of the
Yeah,
time that he was rightly objecting to. Nothing Mal is saying should be an issue to Mr. McCartney, who's the greatest songwriter of, for my money, any generation. It just reminds us what a social process all of this is, and how we benefit, from the string quartet playing on Eleanor Rigby, octet rather, George Martin's work in the arrangement, all of this, we're better at this now, right? When you look at a song by Taylor Swift, there are like 11 authors,
yeah, yeah,
or composers. I think back in the 60s and even well into the latter part of the century, we still kind of cleave to the idea of the solitary genius. But one of the themes that I like to think about with this book is that nobody does it alone. We all have people who help us, right? Like you do amazing work, but I also know you have an amazing wife and family, whom I've met, and who are just
very understanding.
fantastic people. And there's a woman in this house named Janine.
Wonderful woman.
Anything I've ever done, if there's anything I've done that's okay, it's because of her.
Yeah,
People, Paul's life with Linda, my God, how well served he was by having a partner who wasn't just a musical partner, but someone who was supportive and cared about him,
yeah.
and seeing him succeed, and fiercely at times cared about him, seeing him succeed. So, nobody does it alone. And Mal has a small part in the fact, and maybe in a few moments, I would argue a major part in the fact that we have all this great music, namely, I don't, I've been in a few bands. You're in a professional band at the moment, so you'll understand. um, it gets to a certain hour and you just want to go home. You're like, we're done. I've had it. I want to go
Yeah.
eat something. Imagine if you have a Mal Evans, you can stay till 4 or 5 in the morning because he'll get the food, break a guitar string. That's okay. He'll wake up the guys at Sound City. You need this instrument? No problem. Need an anvil?
Yeah,
He's your guy. He knows.
and I'll
he
play
can,
it as well.
yeah, or he'll play if you want him. You might need to count off for him, but he'll play. That it's a jack of all trades. We all need a Mal in
And
our
he was
lives.
there again in the Get Back documentary. It was great because Mal was always in and around, and you could just see, you need something, I'll go and get it. I'll go and do that. He was there around everything that was happening. And it was good to see. And it's interesting that, we talked before that really it's Mal and Neil are the two who were with them from very, very early on, stayed close to them. From all your research discussions with Gary, what do you think it was about Mal that meant that the Fab Four trusted him so much.
Well, I think it's implicit he would have died for them. He was prepared to in the summer of 1966. I mean, he would have given his own life for them. He's one of the first people to realize, outside of whatever confidence they had in themselves and Brian Epstein, just how important they were going to be, right? I mean, he's one of the true believers that they were making something that would stand the test of time. And that was important to him. I mean, how many times, and I know it's in the book several times, did Mal say, I have to think about how I comport myself. I'm representing them. I can't just beat some guy up.
Yeah.
We'll say he was beaten up by the Beatles organization. Mal understood that early on. I mean, they absolutely, well, according to Lily, they were jealous of him at times. Who got to have Mal? Simply because he was so good and loving at what he did. I think like I said before, it's kind of a cautionary tale about a fellow who got to express his feelings as a fan and lover of them in every possible way. It's kind of overwhelming.
Yeah, and he was there, and that's it. And he was such a great observer of what was going on, being right in the middle. Of course, one of the things I thought that we sort of knew about him beforehand was he was a huge Elvis fan, and of course he has that moment with the Beatles of meeting Elvis. I mean, he must have.
Yeah, he loved it. And fortunately for us, that's in the Beatles USA book he wrote, unpublished, that where he spends pages, gushing about Elvis and that experience. Mal, like his son, is just a big kid in a lot of ways. He's a big kid, but with a knowing brain, right? That knows what's important and, can drive, which most kids can't, right? But I think that his childlike delight in things had to be meaningful to them, or they wouldn't have traveled with him. They wouldn't have, they experienced the world with him. It's meaningful that Paul would wake him up and say, I want to go see, Paris or whatever town they were in. Yeah. It's 6 a.m. I don't care. There's that one hilarious moment where Mal went to bed at 5 and Paul's at 6. I think all of those moments speak volumes. He would do anything for them.
Yeah.
One thing that I'm proud that this book does is it does set the record straight. He does not die for them. He does not, while like the rest of the world, he wishes that they were together as a band from 1970 to his end in 1976. He is not flailing because there's no longer a Beatles around. He is living his own life and trying to find himself, as we all do at various points in our existence. And I like that this book is going to help people understand Mal does not die because of the Beatles.
Yeah.
It is a self-inflicted demise.
Yeah. I mean, going back to some of those highlights of going to America, which, were obviously important for him, as a lover of Elvis, but a lover of Westerns. Again, it's for most people of that generation in Liverpool, American culture was everything. So to go over there must have been fantastic. And there's a lovely little story of the Ed Sullivan Show. And a bit of a panic when they weren't there. Tell us all about that one.
Moments when he's losing his mind because he's lost his Beatles. And it was one
Sullivan's lost his.
And when people, some folks said, "You love the Old West, we can help you out," and they'd help him buy replica pistols, and because it's the Old West, right? That in a particular period and maybe even into today, that was interesting to a lot of Brits. The same could be said for Bernie Taupin, for example, and his fascination with that period.
Yeah. There's definitely, there's something there. And you can sort of tell what comes through of that excitement of traveling to America, which, when you've grown up in Liverpool, you're working for the GPO. You got your normal life, as it were, and then suddenly that was the dream. It was the American dream that the Brits had. That was the path to go, and there he was. And being part of that reception, he was basking a bit in the glory of the Beatles, and he loved it. And as you say, he was like a big kid, enjoying every minute.
The best line, and I think it's on the back of the U.S. edition, is the Beatles were better than food or drink.
Yeah,
he couldn't get enough of it, and we know Mal loved food and drink. He really,
yeah,
he was a connoisseur.
Yeah, and of course, one of the things that Mal and Neil became practiced at was the problem of girls and other girls who wanted to get to the Fab Four, and that was an interesting world for Mal, certainly.
It was, it seems kind of tame when it's compared to Led Zeppelin and the kind of bacchanal of the 1970s and maybe even now.
Yeah.
I don't know. I'm not a star like you, so it's so it seems kind of tame, but it was. I think Mal probably saved them from a lot of grief during that period too. There could have been scandals that would have harmed them.
Yeah.
Thankfully, they didn't have any. They're not that kind of people, for one thing. So that certainly protected them. But there were a lot of characters who would try to get close to the Beatles. There were a lot of what Mal and Neil discovered very early on. It was a lot of parents, particularly mothers, that were untrustworthy. That would hurl their daughters, here, and Mal would usefully get them the hell out because he had a good head on his shoulders, at least in that way.
Yes.
I mean, of course, one young woman dies because she can't get to the Beatles in Australia. Not nearly dies in Australia with the suicide attempt.
Yeah.
Oh, there's that awful moment when Mal watches in horror as one woman throws herself at a limousine. There was just legitimate hysteria in those days. And of course, the problem is, and I've said this to so many of the people I've interviewed, and I bet you've had a variation of this, that they're inventing their job.
Yeah.
These jobs didn't exist. No. Mal and Neil were inventing a job. There was a word roadie, but nobody had a guidebook on how to deal with that level of fame
around the world. Yeah.
Or what bands lived in very carefully striated worlds, right? Bands record songs that are written by professionals, produced by professionals, and they go on the road. That's how it works. Nobody had a guidebook for a band like this band that has artistic ambitions and is going to stay in a studio for 16 hours a day. Nobody has that. That roadmap doesn't exist. So, a lot of these guys are just inventing their jobs and trying to just do the best they can in the midst of an all-out storm, a maelstrom.
Yeah, because of course he has to then, in a way, sort of reinvent his job because the Beatles stopped touring in '66.
And then he had to invent the job, what that job is. Yeah. And isn't it amazing that job turned out to be even more time consuming than the one on the road?
Yeah. It's crazy.
I mean, thank goodness, because you and I and the rest of the world have all this wonderful music. I mean, we're benefiting from it. And when I write anything, that is the only end result that matters, because I subscribe to what John Lennon said in his last months. I know we hear about these reunions all the time, but people have all these great records. That's what matters. He knew, even at that late date in his life, that the thing that would last is going to be the music.
Got to be the music, yeah.
And not the songs as sheets of music, but their recordings and what they did. That's the magic.
Yeah, and of course he got to join in on several of the Beatles recordings.
Absolutely.
So he
And
lets me say,
absolutely also to watch, um, the evolution of a song. I
yeah,
mean, is there? I can't imagine a greater privilege than to watch, I don't know, a day in the life in the studio. My
yeah.
God,
Well,
I mean,
that's
look
what
what we
I'd say.
enjoyed just seeing. Yeah,
Yeah,
with
I
Get
love
Back.
that bit in Get Back. That's the first glimpse really we've had into an evolution of a Beatles song, and that's the only one we've seen. He was there, seeing this all the
Right.
time.
And
Wow.
I love the music on Get Back, but look at what we haven't seen.
Yeah, exactly.
The medley, I mean, come together, you name it. I mean, we have to imagine a lot of that.
Yeah, it's great. So then, of course, he gets involved with the Ivies, Badfinger. So he's gone from being sort of road manager, and now he's working with the group as well. And
I think that's the biggest heartbreak in his life as a
yeah,
professional.
yeah,
What happens to him, um, at the hands of several people who did not have Badfinger's best interests at heart. Beginning with Billy Collins, who was their manager, who was paranoid, who was constantly, concerned that someone would take his role, to Mal, who, in his typical way, only wanted the best for those guys, fell in love with them, would do anything for them. He treated them like they were Beatles,
yeah,
and was prepared to do anything to make their careers happen. Stan Polly, who is their chief villain, of course, and is named in Suicide Note.
yeah,
But then, if you didn't have a reason to dislike Alan Klein already, the cruelty of Alan Klein to sever Mal from Badfinger for no reason.
yeah,
The only reason I can come up with is that he wasn't allowed to fire Mal and Neil the year before.
yeah,
He wanted to cut off the head of their closest friends, and then he found out he couldn't do it because they had the perfect answer for him. We don't work for you.
yeah,
They worked for Beatles and Company, and they both paid for it. He worked to make Neil's life a living hell, and anything Mal wanted, he would go the other direction.
yeah,
And
yeah.
Neil was a tougher sort, although he had some rough years in the early 70s with different kinds of substance abuse.
Mhm.
It broke Mal to not be
Yeah.
able to work with them. Is there a worse scene than when George is working on Day After Day and Mal is there with George having to just suck it up because Alan said you can't work with them, and
Yeah,
it's hard.
yeah. And there's almost there's because the tragedy of what happened to Badfinger, with the deaths, and then we move on to almost like the tragedy then of Mal and his
Yeah.
death. There's something. Just that is that quote that I was interested in when you said I was born on August 3rd, 1963, died New York City, 1975. I thought that when I read that, I went back over that several times. I was thinking, wow, the fact that he'd written that down. Do you think he had some sort of sense that things were going to end in a way for him?
I do. I think he had recognized that he had pushed his life into so many compartments. This is the problem with trying to make sure everybody loves you, right? And that everybody exists in their space. It's not reality,
Yeah,
right? And at some point, probably much earlier than that, even, he had to have recognized that keeping Lily and the kids over here, here's George and what I do with George, here's this relationship I have in America, here's this pen pal that I have,
yeah,
he wanted to keep everybody in fine stead. And I think those compartments were probably colliding by that point in 75 where he realized he wasn't going to survive it. And
Mm.
um, he was telling himself at the very end, of course, that he would never see his kids again and these sorts of things. I know divorce was so much less common then, but he had to have known that that wasn't Lily's goal. She just wanted to be done with playing second fiddle since 1963, at least
Exactly. Yes.
since August 1963.
Yeah.
And she'd been on that roller coaster for 13 years. She should have dumped him. When was it? In 69 when he was gone for so long, or 68. And she threatened to. I but I don't, I'm hemming and hawing a little bit because I can't answer that question. I don't know exactly what he was saying. Was he saying that I'm going to tell this story and this is it? That my life started with the Beatles, but it's ending now.
Or was that just his working life he was thinking of?
People who want to orchestrate their own death, and the world of some people aren't going to like this. Mal was committing suicide by cop. He was just a pioneer. We didn't call it that, yet then.
Yeah.
He probably was planning this for a long time, knowing, writing his book in a certain way, making sure that, all the people in his life without fail knew that he loved them. He did get to talk to Paul at the end of his life and was ecstatic, as you know, about those conversations. He had a conversation with John Lennon in the week of his death, maybe even a couple of days before, depending on how it adds up, where John's trying to let him know there's life after divorce. If that's what happens,
yeah,
you'll be okay.
Yeah.
He just couldn't see it, probably because whatever it was had been planned for some time. And of course, it didn't help, as we know, that these are the 1970s in Southern California, where cocaine and liquor are available in mass quantities. And was that terrible moment, that sad moment where Mal says something to Laura Gross, like along the lines of, if I could just get a couple of weeks and clear my head, but it never comes, right? So I think that's just the premonition of the suicide in some way, and that he's finally concluded the book deal, and he's decided that he's going to write this thing, and then the catalyst was Lily saying, "I've actually made an appointment with a solicitor." She hadn't even seen the solicitor; she just made an appointment.
Yeah, and she'd had to put up with so much.
That was the last. But it's not even fair to put that on her. I think he had been thinking about it for a long time.
Yeah. Absolutely.
In that trip in April 75, when he goes back to see the family for the one and only time, and he comes up with the most ridiculous sort of compromise. Let's have an open marriage, and of course she's like, I don't want to be in an open. What are you talking about? She'd actually been in one for a long time. She just didn't know it. But, I think that was him maybe trying to clutch at straws to keep the balls in the air a little longer.
Trying to keep everybody happy at the same time.
Yeah, trying to keep everybody happy. And it was our good friend Ken Mansfield, right, who realized that, when he was talking to Mal on that last evening, you're saying all these good things, Mal, but I'm hearing depression.
Yeah. Yeah. And it was sad. It's a sad ending for someone who was so close. But I mean, things that I learned. So I knew he loved to doodle and to draw. I didn't realize how much he liked writing. Some sort of poetry or lyricist point of view.
He was quite good at all those things. I have several hundred pieces of his poetry that are quite lovely, often self-lacerating. He's quite good. He took art lessons as a kid, and it shows. He was an avid reader. So, back in a time when a lot more people read, he was quite well read. I can see why he could hold his own in the orbit of those guys who were pretty sharp, right? You can see how he's not just a big oaf. right? Which, some folks write him off as.
Mm.
Uh, it's, and Paul was absolutely right in what he said. He said Mal was not a nutter. He
Absolutely
was
right.
not a nutter. But there was no talking Mal out of that room. He knew what he was doing when he went up in that room and he picked up the gun.
Yeah, it's sad. But what a life, what he squeezed into his years. What for you was the biggest surprise, something that you didn't know, you didn't realize? What leapt out at you?
Oh, the first thing I looked up when the diaries came back to America a couple of
Yeah,
years ago, we opened up the boxes and I went right for May 1969. And I went right to Olympic Studios because I knew Paul's line to Mr. Lewison about how that was the day they broke the Liberty Bell of the Beatles, right? They couldn't put it back together again. So I wanted to know, if you were nobody loved the Beatles more than Mal, what
yeah,
would it have been like for Mal Evans to
yeah,
watch basically his family die
yeah.
in front of him? And as you now know, he didn't write anything. He drew a picture of Paul losing his mind. And that completely jibes with what Mr. McCartney said all these years, that, they came to him proposing that we've got to have Alan sign right now. We got to sign with Alan. And Paul has said many times, movingly, we're a big act. He can wait till Monday. It's Friday.
Yeah.
It's the weekend. And that picture just floored me when I saw it. Because by then I knew Mal's style.
Yeah.
And there it was, just Paul, a Beatle going mad at the ridiculousness of what he was facing. And of course, time has absolutely proved Paul right. I mean,
Oh, completely.
everything he couldn't even have predicted all the things that were wrong with Alan Klein. I mean, Alan looted every business he ever worked for. And nobody hated him by the end more than George Harrison.
Yeah.
I mean, my God, George, to be countersued by his own manager for over Brightmoons. I mean, you've got to be a certain kind of con man to pull that off.
Yeah.
So that was moving for me. I particularly enjoyed, like I said, Mal loves Paul in the way we all do. He just admires him and loves his incredible the gifts and how he's made good on them all these years. He loves John. He loved John. He learned to love John Lennon over the years, and John was there for him many times with a kind and often a very philosophical word,
Mm.
Which jibes with what we know about him. But it's the
Yeah.
relationship with George that has really struck me. He's the first Beatle George knew, that Mal knew, was George from the Cavern. And George, at a certain point, works so hard for Mal, trying to help him learn how to know his way around a mixing desk, gets him lessons. He, when Mal wants to be a songwriter, he promotes him at every possible turn. He knows that Mal has written the song for Splinter. Let's go. Let's work on Splinter. He works tirelessly for
Mm.
Mal, and while Mal is suffering over day after day, when they're
Yes.
in the studio, George is still there for Mal, walking him through it. He really came to love and care for Mal in a lot of the ways Mal needed professionally. And, I think when people read this book, if you love George already, and we all do, you're going to love him even more. When he goes
Yeah.
to see Lily in the early 1980s to bare his soul to her, when I first learned that, I choked up.
Mm. Yeah.
I mean, that's what a strong person does. They go and they say, I got to talk to you about this. I got to get this off my chest.
Yeah.
That just is a heartbreak,
It is. And I thought one of the wonderful things was when he'd gone to the four of them and said, right, I'm going to write my book. And all four of them say, you have my blessing, my permission, good luck, and everything. How many other people in Beatle world have such an open blessing from all four Beatles to go and do that.
Him. I think that's, yeah, I
Yeah,
think it's the only one, the one discovery, which I actually have on tape, from Mal's dictation. I had no idea that he had actually quit the Beatles in April 1974.
yeah,
That was brand new.
yeah,
I mean, the world doesn't know that. And that was fascinating. And the responses were fascinating. John and Paul Goodman said, "Here, good for you, Mal. If this is what you need to do, we're going to support you.
yeah,
Whatever you want to do, we have confidence." They said what you need your best friends to say. Ringo's just heartbroken, right?
yeah.
He's said to Harry Nilsson that night, "Well, if Mal's gone, the Beatles are really over."
I mean, that is amazing.
But the one who got it right was George Harrison. You remember what he said?
Go on.
Mal called him up. He was working at Friar Park with Splinter.
Yeah,
Mal's back. He said, "So what?" And when you look at it on its face, it seems really almost cruel, but
yeah,
it's not. He didn't believe it. He didn't believe it for a second. He didn't believe Mal was really quitting. None of them did. They never stopped paying them. A few weeks later, he's working, he's stage managing Goodnight Vienna. It's, I think Paul and John especially said the right loving things, but they had to have known at some level Mal couldn't move on. He didn't want to.
yeah,
And actually the most heartbreaking thing about all of it is, as you and I get to enjoy these moments one after another, the CDs in 87, the anthology, the remasters, the remixes, Beatles Rock Band, Now and Then, all this stuff, Mal would have been loving this.
Oh,
And
absolutely.
if they loved him, he would have been a part of any and everything he wanted to. And it hurts me that he didn't get to see 1977.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And I think maybe what you've been able to do with the book is you've put him in there back where he belongs, right alongside John, Paul, George, and Ringo, in that inner circle, in that
in his right place. He's everything he's
absolutely.
in. Yeah.
Oh, that's where he belongs.
And his love for Neil too. There was no rivalry, there was no hierarchy. He would have died for Neil. I mean,
Yeah. Again, what a friendship, and what those two guys managed to do, working together, and it's almost like that. It's almost like there's a Fab Six.
Oh yeah. Peter Asher said that. He said that, they needed those two guys. In a way, they're kind of good cop, bad cop, but you wouldn't have known it.
Yeah,
They had their roles down so well. He said that Mal was the guy who could get anything done. And, Neil was the guy who made sure that some things didn't happen, and other things. And Neil was kind of like bad cop a lot. But they were right there for them. It just, at the end of the day, it's part of the Beatles story is always a bittersweet one. So I tell my students every semester,
yeah,
one guy's going to be murdered. Another guy's going to die far too young. A manager is going to be pulled out of the story at a certain point. It's just,
yeah,
it breaks your heart. I mean, I'm right there with Paul and Mal crying in the garden in September 1969 in my head that, this musical fusion cannot go on. That's real life.
yeah. And that must be one of the hardest things for him, as you said before. He's seeing his family, his Beatles family, falling apart in front of him. Where instead of all four being in the studio working together, they're all popping in ones and twos, and it's fracturing in front of his eyes, and he can't do anything about it.
Yeah. It's always the kids who suffer.
Exactly. Yeah, absolutely right. Yeah. No, it's an amazing book. So full credit to Gary for trusting you, and obviously you made the right choice. And it's a wonderful book. I've loved reading it. I really have. I've been waiting so long to read this book, and it's great that I learned a lot about him, and I still have the utmost respect, and I think more respect as well. It's something like you were saying just before, where sometimes he's being portrayed as The gentle giant, he's a little bit thick, but he's just a gopher, and he'd do whatever. And you think, no, this was a highly intelligent man who was trusted by John, Paul, George, and Ringo. He was good inventing his own job, and he's very much part of the story. And I've got a lot more respect for him. I've learned so much more about him. And as you say, unfortunately, with real life, tragic comedy, it is real life. But
it hurts. My father read 3 or 4 iterations of this along the way, and he said every time I keep wanting Mal to make different choices at key moments, where it feels more and more irrevocable, but that's suicide, which is the mystery that when a person makes that decision, I mean, poor Fran couldn't tell, she was a very young woman, lived with in LA, that here he is telling her about how to winterize the apartment. She was 26 or whatever. What does that mean to her?
Yeah.
That was his goodbye.
Yeah. I was a sad end for a great man and such a crucial part of the story of the Beatles. And we're just glad. Now, is there going to be a part 2?
Part 2 will be all of the stuff. So part 2, there are many, many more photos Mal took, a lot more photos of Mal and his family. I'm imagining it in a kind of chronological way where, you'll have the diaries, you can read them for yourself. Of course, some of them are written poorly, so I'll have to have some kind of transcription. He's mentioning so many. I think he mentioned several thousand names. Those have to be identified. We're doing that. His notebooks will be there. Drawings by Mal, of Mal, include lots of material of that nature. All of the manuscripts. He had 3 manuscripts. He tried to write a novel. I'm not sure if we'll include that or not, simply because it's kind of unfinished. I'm not sure. I'm not sure how to edit that yet. But I have had it transcribed. But the stuff that folks really want, and what excites me about this is they can go find their own Mal mysteries and their Mal stories, right? Other people who have interests in certain periods of the Beatles story or the post-Beatles story, the solo years, could go to a moment and learn more about Imagine or Plastic Ono Band or what might have Paul had in store for Mal. I know they were talking at the end of 1975 about doing some kind of work together. What might that have been? For other people to go down their own Mal Evans rabbit holes, because there's just so much there, and it's a portrait, as you said earlier, of a guy making up his job as he goes along, trying to solve the problem.
Yeah. What a guy, and what a story. And it's a fascinating story, his story of his humble beginnings, and look what he did with his life. And he was there.
You saw the world.
Yeah. Now, I've absolutely loved it. So thank you so much. It's a great read. And of course, people can buy the book all over the world. What's the launch date?
So the embargo ends on November 1st. We can start talking about these things. The launch date is November 14th. We have a number of events over here at the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame and the Grammy Museum, but then we'll of course got to come to the UK where it all started. Sooner rather than later.
Jolly good. Fantastic. Ken, thank you so much. Been absolutely brilliant.